Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome back to the Mob Archaeologist. I'm Angelo here with Rick, Eric, and Tony. And this evening, we have two very special guests. One is Michael DiLeonardo and his co-host, RJ Rodger. Michael DiLeonardo needs no introduction. He's kind of the godfather of the show, but we'd like to take it to RJ and have him describe what they've been working on in their endeavors.
Thank you, Angelo and Rick and Eric and Tony for the invite. It's a great honor. I got to meet you guys over the phone, and now we're on the show together. And I appreciate you guys. So Michael and I started No Excuses on YouTube, coming up on about 5 months now. I originally started on Black Handprint Mafia, my first YouTube channel. So I met Michael because I made a show on him, and that show, I somehow made it to him. And then we came together, and after about 6 months of being friends, started a show together. Here we are now.
Yeah, you guys have done some pretty amazing work. One thing that separates Michael apart from most other people is the bloodlines. Most people get into it, they're, one off for a generation. Michael's got the bloodlines that goes all the way back to Bisacchino, and he remembers an era when that type of stuff still meant something or was more of a factor than it is today. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Yes. When a paisan really met a paisan, they were like brothers when they came to this country. Very clannish people. And their social clubs and their gatherings were as such. They had their own, each town had their own social club. And later on, it got watered down where it was like 1 or 2 clubs in the neighborhood where that just dissipated, went away, that real clannishness of what this came from Sicily to here.
So moving on to Rick, would you like to begin?
Sure. Hey, Michael, thanks for being here. I appreciate you spending time with us, and thank you, RJ. And my first question concerns Salvatore D'Aquila. For those who don't know, he was a New York boss. He was an early boss of the Gambino crime family, and he was also the boss of bosses, capo di capi, and he was the boss of the family from around approximately 1910 to his death in 1928, and he was the boss of bosses beginning around 1912, going from memory. So he was a major player in the early American mafia. Significant role. We learned about him from information provided by Nicola Gentile and Joe Bonanno, and little nuggets here and there besides them, but those are our primary sources. And he was little known outside of the mafia during his lifetime. But Michael's family has a connection to him. So, Michael, going by what you know, could you describe D'Aquila to us? What he was like, what you heard about him, passed down, what he was like as a person, as a boss. I mean, just anything.
Yeah, my grandfather hooked up with D'Aquila early on in the 1900s. My father became his godson. He baptized my father. And from then on, my father was born in 1912. And from then on, my grandfather was very close to him. He did it, from what I understand, the stories, when they were having those early wars, my grandfather was very involved in a lot of the work that was done, a lot of the murders. He was a top guy to D'Aquila. He was made a captain under him. Also, my grandfather baptized his daughter, Rosie, later on when she was born, probably maybe 1922, 23-ish, like that. So they maintained a very, very strong friendship throughout. And the stories I heard from my father was compelling as far as them going upstate with major meets. My grandfather had two places, one in Katona, New York, and one in the Highlands in New York. And the Highlands, all the guys used to go up, they used to go practice shooting for their wars and stuff like that, hunting and etc. But that's what they would do. And in Katona, there was these meets that they would have with their crew. And my father, as a young boy going up there, would drive with them. And he had some pictures of D'Aquila up at the farm, but they're non-existent. They stayed in the house when his house burned down, my brother's house. And we lost a lot of those pictures. But I have a few pictures of D'Aquila that I will share one day. I have 3. They're gold right now, and I'm going to hold on to them for the right moment. But he was, according to my father, a very, very stern man, rigid. And if you look at the pictures, and I showed Angelo one day a picture of it, and you could see that royalty, like a Caesar almost pose on a profile shot. And he dictated a lot what went on in his country. My father said that, he placed guys in different families all over the country, which later on somebody wrote as they were spies put in different families. But they really weren't spies. They were really like emissaries or people he placed. You can't be a spy if you're placed there. So I think it was a wrong term that was made. But it's super impactful. When he was murdered, October 10th, 1928, he drove himself to the doctors with his kids, his wife, and had an argument in the street, and they shot him 9 times. And my father would tell me that he had a bulletproof car, a Pierce Arrow. And when I say by bulletproof, it was made to withstand any kind of assault on the car if he was in it. He happened to be out of it. And he knew the guys, whoever they were, and they shot him. Shot him 9 times with dum-dum bullets, or hollow point bullets. And he was dragged into a pharmacy where he, they tried to revive him, but he was dead. And it was a huge impact on my grandfather and his crew. I mean, they were, according to my father, they were out. There was going to be no peace until they avenged his death. And with the Maranzanos and Minio Ferrigno and the rest of those guys, anybody had to do anything to do with his murder, we're going to go. And his relationship with a guy like Joe Traina, which is one of the most unheralded or noticed guy in history. This guy was very, very powerful. He was like a boss, this guy. He was a boss, but in the sense of D'Aquila's boss, who led many missions to Cleveland and other meetings to try to patch things up after his death. So, his relationship with D'Aquila, my grandfather, being my grandfather was 3 years younger than him, was extremely tight. After he died, my grandfather bought a piano for his kids. He bought their family a piano. My grandfather would drop off $2,000 a month, according to my father, to his family afterwards. He loved them. His picture, D'Aquila's picture, was on my grandfather's nightstand. So my grandfather died in 1971. So much he loved this guy.
Wow.
He's loyal to him. So I know there was a lot of trepidation at that time when after he got killed, they didn't know what was going to go on. But his crew wouldn't stand down, from what I was told, until they were all gone. Masseria et al. So I think that gets lost in history about D'Aquila, because he really, when he got killed, he was, New York Times wrote him up as a cheese importer. They didn't even know who he was, who got killed. So, you talk about the names like Luciano and Morello. This guy fit in between there for the beginning and then up to Luciano and all the stories. This guy was hugely impactful. And I really appreciate the work you guys have done, digging a lot of stuff up on him, including my grandfather going back to Sicily in the 1920s. With other emissaries, because they have problems in Sicily. I'm sure you guys got into it. Maybe one day we will also with you. But there was wars going on. There was issues going on. And Sicily and the United States was very, very well connected at the time. It was still almost like one until they started to break away, from what I understood. So this guy had huge power on both sides of the Atlantic in the States. And I think he needs to be talked about a little bit more.
But I understand he was only 5'2", so for a little guy, he still had a lot of power.
What
Size didn't affect him.
Yeah, you know what? They were all those Sicilians, most of them were little short guys. And what's interesting about D'Aquila, from what I know, my grandfather's town, Busacchino, was in the mountain. And it was more towards the south. Well, Palermo's on the water, and then you come into the mountain, and on this side of Sicily is Agrigento, Provincial Agrigento. And on that side, D'Aquila's crew was extremely friendly with them. They were very friendly with that crew. And, up until when I was come around and in that life, and D'Aquila's son, Jerry, I was very, very close with him. He's one of my mentors. Zaccaria, which was brother-in-law, his father was married to D'Aquila's wife's sister. So there was all these connections with these people that I grew up with at that time. And he hung out a lot with the Agrigento guys, Jerry D'Aquila. And it was an interesting fact, because you thought, like I said earlier, they're pretty much clannish. Of course, D'Aquila was born in the city of Palermo, but his a strong part of his group was from Agrigento. So he crossed that divide and put all these other guys in these other towns together. My grandfather came from Busacchino, and there was a family called the Ramoris. Very, very strong. There was later on Joe Gallo's crew. The Ramoris, Sam and Louis, his father was Anthony, was in that crew. So that crew goes way back also. And all these relationships he built loyalty. D'Aquila built a lot of loyalty in his family. And, loyalty goes so far, and in that life, and then there was the outside influences with Masseria, but in his own crew, they were very strong. And it wasn't just Palermo guys or Busacchino guys, it was the Agrigento guys and other towns where Traina came from. What was the town he came from again?
Belmonte Mazzagno.
Right, thank you.
Yep.
So just that, how we and he was there how many years? He lasted a long time as a boss, D'Aquila.
16 years.
16
Through
years.
Prohibition. During the most turbulent time in American history, he lasted the longest.
Right.
There's some of the biggest changes going on in American mafia. He was there. He oversaw that.
Now look at the war that was going on in Cleveland. My Uncle Vinny was my father's younger brother. His godfather was killed during the war, not in Cleveland, in New York. My Uncle Johnny's godfather, we believe it's Joe Leonardo, and he was killed in the war over there. And my grandmother would tell me, they killed all three of their godfathers. The fathers would be in D'Aquila and the other two during this war. So you're right. This time was not only in New York City, there was wars all over. Chicago too. Tony could speak to that also. There was a lot of stuff going on. I will go to the Statler Hotel meeting, which I believe was a follow-up to him getting murdered, that being D'Aquila, in 28. That meeting's in December in Cleveland. And that relationship, and Masseria, as you guys could speak to, had a relationship with the Cleveland guys also, right? So that faction there, they were warring with each other like everybody else at that time. They had the sugar wars and all this other stuff later on. But extremely influential. All the people that showed up to Statler, Angelo, maybe you could put that picture up at that meeting. I'm sure a lot of people have seen it, but it's very interesting. There's a list of names that are attached that you can see the participants. I think Tony could speak that Al Capone was supposed to be on his way there. The non-member, Tony? The guy that these type of meetings, Grand Council?
I mean, there's different reports. Apparently, it was the Chicago police that actually tipped off the Cleveland police. But, that's how it got reported. I think some people thought that Fellow, who was Capone's rival for the Chicago family, may have tipped him off or somebody, allied with him. There was a lot of speculation at the time that got reported in the papers, and we don't often know what the actual facts were. But apparently it was Chicago police that called Cleveland and told them that there was a meeting of some sort happening.
So
And
it was like an Appalachia, right?
Yeah, there was a bunch of Chicago guys there, right? You talked about Leonardo. Leonardo was from Licata, from Agrigento. right? And he was close to D'Aquila and had connections to your family. That's another example of a connection between D'Aquila and mafiosi from Agrigento. But I would also think that Leonardo may have been one of the supporters. D'Aquila wasn't, again, as people said earlier, he wasn't just the boss of what we now call the Gambino family. He was the capo dei capi over the entire American mafia. So he would have had certain bosses of families that would have been critical supporters of his. And I think some of these conflicts we see in different families and cities around the country, they're tied to that national politics as well as their own internal dynamics, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's that well said, and that's what's the amazing part, you know. And Joe Gallo comes when he came into this country with his father. I think he was born in Alabama, right?
Yep.
Gallo.
Yeah, born in Alabama.
Yeah, and they came over. They were from Bizic and Easy, like the Ramoris and some other guys that they were close to. And I met Joe Gallo several times, and then when I was going to get straightened out, Mr. Lilo, I met him up by Lanza's restaurant, De Roberts in Manhattan. That was their crew. That was a crew that took out Abbott Anastasia, by the way.
Yep.
That's a subject for another time, but that was that crew. And Mr. Lito took me next door to see Joe Gallo. And he says, here's your paisan. You know, he knew who I was, but he told Joe on the side, we're going to straighten Michael out. I proposed him, meaning Lilo telling Gallo, he proposed me to get made. And this is early on, this is early 80s when I met him. So, you know, and it's still held with those old timers. These old timers still holding on to those little towns in Sicily.
Like you said, the Rumore brothers were with Gallo. So, I mean, and then when I looked into Joe Gallo, his origins in Alabama, they were around Rumores there. I don't know what the relation is, but they were around Rumores in Alabama, Rumores in Manhattan, Queens. So they stayed with their own.
Yeah, very close. They were very close. I'll share a story. RJ, don't get mad at me. I'll share a story. I've always heard a story about the guy who shot, or the guys who shot Rumori, right? My grandfather's very close with this guy. And I always heard that my grandfather found the guy, shot him, and put him in a bakery oven.
Mm.
So, you know, you think, maybe it's just a story growing up, you know, you never hear it. I'm at a wake years later, one of the Rumori wakes out in Queens. And Louis comes over, and I know Louis, some little kid. It wasn't friendly, lived out there, but I seen him occasionally. My father would take me as a little kid to go see him. They would talk. My brothers were in that union at one time, that the Coca-Cola unions, I think it was 707, that they controlled. And my brothers had some influence with elections and all that other stuff at the time. So anyway, we're at the wake, and I'm there with Junior Gotti. And he comes over and he tells Junior, he says, you know this guy's grandfather? What he did for my father? The guys that shot him, he killed him, put him in the oven. I says, it's true. You know, you hear from your father, you hear from my uncle. He goes, this guy knew it was his father got shot. And he shared that story right in front of Junior. I see Junior's face, like, because I never told him that story, you know? So, you know, those connections, I guess my point long-windedly is those connections, those paisans were so strong that they lived and died for each other at that time. For the most part, not everybody, it's not absolute. They did trick each other at times, but that D'Aquila coup was very strong, his faction.
A quick question while we're still talking about D'Aquila. You know, you obviously have this understanding of who he was. You knew his son. You know, he baptized your father. All these relationships. How well known do you think he was within the Gambino family? Like, are some of the other guys who got made in the 80s, is he going to be a name that they even know, or are they just living their lives? Does any of that history, that deeper history, come up in the Gambino family when you're in it?
You know what? That poses a great question. Like anywhere else in the world and anything else you do, any other peoples of the world, when you stop forgetting where you came from and the history of the people that brought you to where you are today, you lose a lot. You lose a lot in your culture, in your forming, your bonding with each other. And, you know, the guys that I knew growing up my age, very, very, very few cared about history. I'll throw a name at you. He's not going to like it. Sammy Gravano.
I was going to say,
I don't even think he knew he was Sicilian. I never even had that Sicilian stuff. Like people, I talk to people, you're Italian? No, I'm Sicilian. He never said it. And mostly every Sicilian will say, I'm not Italian, I'm Sicilian. That's that old school mentality. So I hung out with a lot of the old timers. Like I said, D'Aquila's son, Paulie Zach's father, Cologino, Utsukali, they used to call him Utsukali. He was murdered also, but he wasn't murdered in the war. He was murdered in 47, another story. But I hung out with these guys, and they had that old world attachment. Those guys are gone. Philly Mordecai, another older, his father was Onofrio Mordecai, was in my grandfather's crew. That was part of that crew going way back. Another guy, Tano Longo, he was in that crew, and Gaetano. And his son, Nicky, was a wise guy, and his other son, John, was Paulie Get the Cannolis, the guy that got killed in The Godfather. He became an actor. But when I would hang out with these older men, they would all reminisce. Like I said, Lilo was he was an old man when I got him, you know what I mean? When I started getting proposed and hanging around him more and more, they would share those stories. They were about the old stories. They're about all the recognizing where you came from. Today, it's for the most part, it don't exist. They don't even care. It's a different generation today. It's this generation. Get on here. For the most part.
Michael, I mean, if I could ask a follow-up question, just because I think it's relevant to the stuff you're talking about with D'Aquila. So another person that was connected to that group of people, the Gambino family, was Vito Cascio Ferro, right?
Mm.
And from my understanding, he was born in Sambuca in Agrigento. His family and he later on in life were connected closely to Buscino, as well as the city of Palermo. So I'm wondering if he might have been one of those connections or liaisons, because, like you said, Busacchino is close to the border with Agrigento. It's in the mountains, in the interior. If anything, it's closer geographically to Corleone. You might think in New York, the Busachinesi would fall in with Corleone, right? But they don't. They fall in with the Palermitan-dominated, what we can now call the Gambino family, right? So I'm wondering if Vito Cascio Ferro could have been an important link, linking Agrigento, Busacchino, and Palermo City.
100%, and I'll tell you why. I think I sent Angelo a copy of a coat of arms that I have for my family. Angelo, did I send you a copy of that? Okay, in there, I believe it says Zambuca. My family passed through Zambuca one time or another, lived in Zambuca. You're right on point, Tony. And then the connection with Cascio Ferro and was Busacchino. 100% with the Ramoris, the Gallos, et cetera. You can keep going down the line. And it was very close to Corleone. And when my grandfather had filled out some paperwork coming to the United States, he puts down he was from Corleone in one of them.
interesting.
So you got Zambuca, you got Corleone, and even Acreali going way back into the 16th or 1700s with my family at one point lived there. Angela, if you want, you could put up a copy of the coat of arms. Be my pleasure if you want to share it. And just
I found your great grandfather's birth record, born in 1837 in Bisacchino, and you mentioned that he was a mafioso too. So your grandfather was born there, and he came here. He got made into what's now the Gambino family, but your great grandfather would have been one of the old timers of the Bisaccanesi. And, Cascio Ferro was a bit young. He was kind of in between, I think, your grandfather and great grandfather's age. And, years ago, I saw you on a BBC documentary, and you mentioned Cascio Ferro's connection to your family. And at first, you'll watch a documentary and it's like Carlo Gambino was sent here by Cascio Ferro. Everyone was sent here by him. But then I did the math and it's like your family was from Bisacchino. I was starting to learn about those connections more. Then several years later, I'm going through the back of this book about Joe Petrosino from Italy.
right.
And there's a 1909 letter from Vincenzo DiLeonardo in Brooklyn. Very short, vague letter. You've seen it, but I was like, there's something here. He was communicating with Cascio Ferro overseas in a very cryptic letter in 1909, which tells me he might have been made by then. They were made, he's probably close to 30, right?
He was born 1880.
There you go. Okay.
Got here 1895 at 15 years old. Yeah, he was already off. I got some great stories. I can't share these with you about Petrosino and my grandfather and Enrico Caruso and all. Got some pretty nice stories. But you're 100% correct. And you guys brought the letter to my attention. I didn't find that letter. On the Black Ham Forum at that time when you started posting some really nice stuff. And it's super interesting to see that was right after his murder. And my father would always take credit proudly at that time that they killed the guys from his town killed Petrosino. And then later on, as the facts start to unwind, you see, yeah, that really happened too. That was the guys from his town. So my father knew a lot, and that connection, great deal of respect out of my father's mouth about Cascio Ferro. My father never met him, of course, but just the stories that were brought and told to him by my grandfather never talked. I don't know if he talked to my father. He probably did. They asked a lot of stuff. And again, my father was a driver. My father was driving at 12 years old, and really driving, not just, then it was a little different. You could drive anywhere. So by 14, 15, all the way up, he was already hanging out on Elizabeth Street. So he heard all these stories and hung around all the old guys. I know he met all these guys. So this would and D'Aquila and Morello and the rest of them, so interesting and great work putting it together.
Yeah, it's something that you talked to us about when we first got to know you was your grandfather going to Sicily, and you knew that he had gone with other mafiosi, and then that led to me kind of looking through immigration records, and sure enough, I think it was 1924, your grandfather goes to Sicily with Paolo Palmieri, who's a very important Castellamarese Buffalo member connected to the Bonanno family, and it's right there. Paolo Palmieri attended the 1928 Hotel Statler. He attended some other important meetings. There's later your grandfather traveled with Andrea Torregrassa, who's an important Gambino member, but it's right there. And the timing, I think you alluded to earlier, that was when a war is ramping up in Palermo that D'Aquila is helping with. And right at that time, Jimmy DiLeonardo, who you say, he's a captain under D'Aquila, and then Paolo Palmieri, who, that shows you that they were representing the American mafia, probably on behalf of D'Aquila at that time.
Oh, 100%. And Paul Palmieri, I've heard that name forever in my house as a little boy. Cards being exchanged, as I remember all the cards, the Delicados, the Palmieris, and so many different last names. As a kid, you don't recognize those names for what they are later on. But my grandfather and Paul Palmieri were trying to make a machada, a marriage between my Uncle John and one of Paul's daughters. And it was right after World War II when my uncle came home and he wanted no part of it. And Paul had offered a $50,000 dowry if they got married. And my grandfather wasn't happy with him, not accepted. It was like a slight, but they remained a very close friendship. And I think Paul wound up moving to New Jersey after a while, and they maintained this real solid relationship because I've heard that name, and my grandfather and him got along really well. And I heard about those trips, and then when she showed me the manifest going over, Toro Grosso, and I got pictures of my father in Sicily in 29 and before with Toro Grosso. And there's a gentleman in one of the pictures with a straw hat on. They're walking in Sicily somewhere, and they got their arms locked like this. And that meant either they were compadres or just really close or paisans. I would love to identify that third party. One's my grandfather, one's Toro Grosso. And I'm not sure what trip that was. I think he's on one of the shipping manifests also that you have. So, yeah, there was multiple trips going back to Sicily. And they brought money for an stand and messages and emissaries to make peace or instigate. But I think it was more to try to make peace there.
Makes sense. Yeah. They were all connected at that point. It was one umbrella organization, Cosa Nostra. Obviously it got less so in your time, but there's still people out there. I mean, the Sicilian faction today. I mean, I imagine their brother, the Rosario Gambino's made in Sicily. His brothers are made with the Gambino family. His son's made in LA, whatever exists there now. So they probably see it the same way.
Yeah,
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a small fraction of that. But you talk about one of the guys in Sicily got caught on tape. I think it was a Palazzolo, who from Busacchino, some way, somehow, they took credit for killing Petrosino, actually being one of the shooters. That came up in the news maybe 4 years ago or so.
Yep.
Put on tape talking about that.
Yeah.
Who said yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
Me. That's
Yeah.
true.
You want to help me out over here? Go
But I
ahead.
don't know all the specifics, but I read about that too. I don't know, I read the same information that there was some kind of tape that came out that was an old recording of someone that had was confessing to it or mentioning that they killed him or something. I know what you're talking about though. Yeah.
I think I know what you're talking about. There was a guy who mentioned his grandfather or uncle or great uncle, something to that effect, that had been involved. Yeah.
Yeah.
But apparently it was some kind of recording that was really old recording that they just recently unearthed. I guess I forget how long ago. I don't remember what year it was, but it was in after I don't know the exact date. I wish I had that with me. In the 2000s though it was.
So
Apparently.
if you take that, and I think the Palazzolo's wound up settling in Detroit. Tony, you have any info on Detroit? Who's got Detroit stuff?
The Palazzolos in Detroit are from Terracini and Cinisi. So I don't know what connection they would have with Busacchino.
No, I think the guy was from Terracini.
Yeah, that's a town that connects very, very strongly to sort of a core group in Detroit, and also St. Louis if we go farther back too. So that was a really important small town, but very important in U.S. mafia history.
Yeah, Badalamenti was from there too, wasn't he?
Cinisi, Gaetano Badalamenti. Yeah, I mean they're right next to each other, but they have separate families. Yeah.
Yeah, so with this guy taking credit, maybe he had some relatives in Busacchino at the time, or delegated by Cascio Ferro to be one of the shooters, right? So that would be his reach in a different part of Sicily, if they weren't from Busacchino, into that town to delegate. Because where was he killed? He was killed by the
Palermo.
Yeah, Palermo. What was that square, right? What the hell's the name of that square?
Piazza, yeah.
Yeah, right.
It was it Constantino and Passananti that were from Partenico, right? They were rumored to be involved in it in some level.
I think it was a joint operation between all three of the families in the U.S. at the time, as well as probably the entire leadership of the Sicilian mafia. I mean, this was a big thing. He was really on their case. I mean, Petrosino was really bugging these guys.
Yeah, it apparently started out of an assault Petrosino did on Ignacio Lupo, who was the boss of the Gambino family before D'Aquila. So it was pretty serious. And, so it looks like they were not only all involved here, but multiple families were involved in Sicily.
Now think about that connection, and that's how strong these guys were. And it was never really solved. They locked up a lot of guys trying to shake the tree at that time, but nothing ever transpired of it. And the letter, we talked about the letter, that's something you could put up there and show everybody that, there is that connection.
And the letter too, the letter your grandfather wrote to Cascio Ferro, it's very suggestive. I mean, it's something to the effect of, tell me about the business, or tell me about, like, he's asking for an update, and it's right on the heels of the Petrosino murder. Maybe he's the liaison. He's obviously not, as you, would say, he's not asking that question just for himself. He's not just, hey, I'm curious about the Petrosino murder. Obviously, he's doing that on behalf of somebody, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, D'Aquila was he still in Palermo at the time of the murder in 1909? Because the passenger manifest I have for him was in 1910, arriving in New York. But I don't know if there's an earlier manifest that I haven't seen. I wasn't sure exactly what year D'Aquila was confirmed to have arrived in New York.
1904 or 5. No
So then
later
he
than
went back and then,
6.
yeah, that makes sense. He went back and then came back in 1910, it looks like.
Hmm.
Well, he
And
was
that's
arrested.
around when he became boss, because that's when Lupo got arrested for the counterfeiting thing that was partnered with the Morello family, right?
He was arrested in 1905 or 6 as a competence man,
Okay.
and then nothing happened. And then he traveled back and forth to Sicily, as everybody did. But then in 1911, he's coming back with Giuseppe Traina.
Oh, you got that manifest?
Yeah,
Oh, that's gold. Yeah, send it to me if you get a chance.
yeah. Rick found it.
Oh, really? Very good, Rick. Very good. That's a good one. That's gold.
And Michael, you mentioned a little bit ago, I mean, well, since Traina came up again, he's a guy that I've done a lot of research on. As you said, I completely agree. One of the most overlooked and therefore successful. I mean, I don't really look at this stuff in terms of who was successful, who was not. But when you think about the intention behind Cosa Nostra, Traina was, we know that he represented D'Aquila nationally as the acting boss of bosses, which who can say that, you know? And then he's a part of the D'Aquila administration. He then goes on to become a capo di Cina. We know that he was involved with Philadelphia for something like 60 years, helping elect bosses there. Even after D'Aquila died, Traina is still the liaison for the commission and the Philly family. And so you knew his son. How did you get introduced to his story? You know, how did you hear about Traina?
Yeah, same thing in my house. The same thing. I mean, they were really close. Again, Christmas cards going back and forth. Joe died almost 100, I think. He was in his mid-90s, somewhere around there. He lived a really blessed life in that life. They didn't kill guys like him, the messengers, the good messengers. They were like the old story of don't kill the messenger. He was the guy they didn't kill. They must have made that after him. Don't kill that guy. He's the right guy. He's trying to make peace all over, bring the right messages. Yeah, he was an iconic figure in our group at that time. The older time, they really looked up to him. His son Mario became a captain. Mario was a great guy. I know Mario since I'm a little boy also. I would go to Mario's club on 70th and 18th Avenue and hang around with the old timers when I wanted to just have a little fun with them, you know, and bring messages. I brought some messages back and forth there. But yeah, you heard all those stories about guys like this. And I met the old man, but he was really old at the time. You know, he was really inactive. He was a captain until he died, until his son took over. And it's one of the oldest crews in the country, maybe the second oldest in the country. So
Yeah. Seems like they were, I think that crew was entirely Sicilian. From what's known about them, I think they only had Sicilian members under them, even guys who were born here.
yeah, Lacospres, Cirillo, no, was in that crew. Joe Oxy Marino, he was in that crew too. I pushed him to be the captain there after Mario died. Junior had made me talk to him. He wanted to see who was going to put there, and Joe was a prisoner of war in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. And after sitting down learning all this, we made him a skipper. He can stand up as a prisoner of war. He can stand up on the street. But a great crew, a great tradition in that crew. And, you know, I respected those guys. All the old times, they gravitated because they had this history about them, this feel, this nobility almost, you know, where their roots came from. And it really felt good to be around them. And it wasn't this nasty talk out of the side of the mouth. I got to prove I'm a gangster, tough guy. It was different. It was, you know, there was, you want a plate of this, you want that. Come on, have some sausage. No, these guys didn't play that shit. You know, they were rigid in a way, but very accommodating in others as far as the people they were close to. You know what I mean? Even a kid like myself walking in. Hey, there's the kid, you know, the old timers used as the kid routine, you know, but they knew my lineage. And as soon as I walked in the club, boom, it was not because of my position at the time, I was a skipper, but it was just because they know me since I was a kid, you know. So Traina's name was legendary, and he should be spoken about a little bit more information, a little bit more about it, to put history in its place, because that's what we're all about here, right? It's not about getting on TV and making a show about trade. It's to put the history in place, and whatever transpires after that, it's in the right spot.
That's why I find that older time so much more interesting to listen to. I mean, to study about, because you're studying more of like a system and like, you know, a culture and something that had like a meaning. It didn't just feel like, to me, like it was always just like the way it does now, or as it got later on, and you know, you took away, like I talked about before, you take away the blood elements of it, the kinship elements of it. I find like what you're talking about, the old timers and the rituals that existed there, where it really meant something. That's what I struggle to find today.
Was there a lot of
later
home
on?
like in I agree 100%. And because I mean, it sounds to me like you go into the Traina club and it's a completely different world than some of the other clubs you're going to. Were they talking about hometowns and stuff like that during your time? Were those old timers talking that way?
Oh yeah, yeah, and like Jerry used to go over to hang out with the Jersey guys in Elizabeth. I was there as a kid. My father would take me where Jerry was working at one time when they took him down and all that stuff, and he was having a little problems, money. He went to go hang out with those guys, and he worked in the bar. And he's a wise guy that was captain. Now he's working in the bar. He was really embarrassed and taking lucky he didn't get killed, at the time. And I would go out there, be all the Jersey guys. All these Jersey family, Argento guys.
Yep.
So very, very close with these guys. And they never broke ties. Like I said, their fathers that were murdered or survived, the sons became friends. They stayed friends. Most of those guys went into life. So they carried those old school traditions and those bonds. And like I said, my grandfather and his crew, those guys was out killing guys for each other. And it wasn't like other wars today, more political bullshit. And I hate this guy. He screwed my girl. Now I got a shot to kill him. I'm going to go kill him or whatever. Drugs. He beat me to drug down. Now we're at war. I'm going to go sneak him. This is a little bit different. These guys really fought for their principles at that time.
Mhm.
And the Arcuris were kind of liaisons between the DeCavalcantes and your family. And that's obviously a name. I mean, you knew Joe Arcuri and all that. That's history, though, right there.
Yeah, and his father, Uto Megiddo, Mikey, he was another major factor. This crew was under the radar almost forever, but a very influential family, good last name, where they came from. Oh, forget it. His father was Traficante. His godfather was Traficante. So, to look at these nexuses that you have all over the country. And on the junior, there were some messages sent through Joe Curry to the Traficantes in Tampa, in the 90s, back and forth with businesses in Tampa. So Joe was still like an emissary. Joe was the emissary, and New Orleans, the same thing. New Orleans family came into us still, when I was in the street, they came to New York. I just missed them. So, yeah. And John and, when he was in his reign, we did business with New Orleans family. So there was an arrest there. So it's about records. I think that my words, they were arrested together. These guys are our family guys. So, there's a lot of ties that were maintained. Today, not as much. You mentioned a little bit. There's a little segment maybe in the Banana Guys and our family to go back with tradition and stuff. And they hold that. The respect level much higher, much higher. The rest, it's been really Americanized today. I believe in that history. As we started this conversation, is I don't think it means much to anybody. Batter up. Who's next? Come on, I got some life in me. Who's next?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about some of the deeper history, which is usually on our, on this mob archaeologist show. That's what we focus on. But we're interested in sort of history across the range of the American mafia, right? So one of the things, we've had conversations before, over the phone and so forth. And one of the things you brought up before that was interesting and sort of a story, because you were telling us about Anthony Spiro's club, which if I'm not mistaken, that was in Bath Beach on Bath Avenue by like Bay 16th Street, right? Yeah. And you said that Anthony Spiro's club was sort of like a place that guys from other families back in the day, like from outside of New York, if they needed to get a hold of a connected guy in New York, they would come to Anthony Spiro's club because it was sort of like a neighborhood nexus and where guys not just from the Bonanno family, from other families could be gotten a hold of. And you kind of, to illustrate that, you said that you remember once, this was before you were made, so you were a younger guy, and you were told that Chicago, the Chicago family sent some guys to Brooklyn to Anthony Spiro's club to collect a debt of some sort. And you believe it was connected to the Gambino family having some interest with Chicago in the Las Vegas skim. If I'm not mistaken, that's what I remember, that was news to me, you know? We know that Chicago was partnered with the Midwest families like Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Cleveland. And the Vegas skim in the 70s and the early 80s was a huge deal. I mean, that's what the Scorsese movie Casino, right, is a semi fictionalized account, right, of what was going on with Chicago then. But it's interesting. I mean, just this little anecdote of something that's kind of like a side note in history, right? But it could point, even if you weren't connected to these guys, right, that there are these connections that exist, right, at some level. Do you remember what that was? Do you remember who they were connected to in Brooklyn?
Well, what happened was, first of all, you were 100% about Spiro's Club. It was probably the biggest place, maybe in the whole country, where you have the most integrated of all the families, guys, members every day, got along, passed messages. It wasn't just an in and out. These guys hung out with each other on a daily basis. Probably the biggest ever. I mean, in my time, where people could find somebody. You want to find anybody, go to the Spiro's Club. There's somebody who knows somebody could get that guy within a day.
Yeah.
Because the family's there.
Right.
So these guys know each other. They pass through all the time. Number guys, people taking numbers, whatever it was. Crap game. There was a crap game there. So everybody showed up. So one day I show up there, it was the early 80s, I believe, late 70s, early 80s. And Paulie Zach says, stick around. I said, what's the matter? He says, there may be a problem. I said, what happened? He says, there's some guys coming from Chicago. They come in the club. They're looking to collect the debt. And there may be an issue there. If they get stupid, we're going to hurt them, not kill them, but there could be a problem. Hang around.
Yeah.
So you can hit a wise guy or whatever, but if the conversation goes bad, because the Chicago guys are Chicago guys, like anybody else. I'm sure they know deference and respect and all that, but he told me just to hang around. And it had to do with the monies. And I'm going to tell you, I throw the story that I think happened now. There was a hotel called the Bonanza. I think it was the Bonanza Hotel. There was some kind of hotel there. And the Chicos went there, Georgie and Butter, and they went there, they beat the casino. And they were going out there. A lot of Gambino guys would go out there at times and be different emissaries or couriers to take money back, from what I understand. We had place guys out there in different casinos, like every other family, just about. There was interest out there, and people had the connections out there, and some of these guys would bring money back. So on this day, I was told to hang around because if it gets stupid, we're going to hurt them. So it never happened.
Yeah.
But there was the connection that I learned about early, and that Chicago was in basically control of these monies.
Of the Vegas stuff.
Yeah, the Vegas.
They did that for like Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Cleveland, and so forth. And they would cut the money up with Kansas City and distribute it. They were partnered with Balistrieri, who was the boss in Milwaukee. So they had essentially like a business partnership where they each had a percentage that came back to them, right? But unsurprisingly, it wouldn't be as shocking if they also had some arrangements with some of the New York families, because like you said, not just the Gambinos, but other families from the East Coast, they also had things happening in Vegas.
West Side. It's West Side at the time.
Yeah.
Fat Tony, and it was.
Yeah.
They had big interest there.
Yeah, and they were closely connected to Chicago, so you can imagine there would have been some arrangements and some deals worked out and so forth. That's interesting. They would, if they were looking for a guy who's connected in Brooklyn, even if it was from the Bonanno family, they would go to Spiro's Club. This was back before you have, WhatsApp or whatever that people have. So if you want to find the guy, they're just going to know. You go to Brooklyn, you go to this place on Bath Avenue, and you ask around and you look for somebody. So Spiro's Club wasn't just like a Bonanno family club. It was guys from any family. And so if someone from out of town wanted to come, it was like a destination.
That was the place. Exactly.
It's very interesting, right?
Yeah, you know what? Spiro is probably another one of the most underrated guys around. He was a real neighborhood type guy. I liked him very much. I mean, this guy treated me great my whole life. He underestimated himself. That's what kind of guy he was. He was so well liked by everybody. Everybody. I never heard a guy. Well, now you hear other people talk negative about him. The guy's dead off the street or whatever. But before that, nobody ever talked bad about Anthony Spiro. The guy was great, and that's why he's fast in the Banana Family.
Yeah.
Which he didn't want. Which he didn't want. He didn't want to go anywhere. He wanted to be a soldier.
How did you feel about other families? You know, there's all this hype about rivalries, and I mean, this applies to New York, inside of New York as well as outside of New York. Did it feel like a big deal? I'll start with this. Did it feel like a big deal when you heard about other families around the country? Was it a thing where you wanted to know more, wanted to meet them? Or was it just sort of like, this is our network, these are our people. It's, if you have a reason, you'll think about it. If not, you don't. How did you feel about that?
Great question. You know what? Growing up, as everything we just talked about, right? That I knew, it always piqued my interest. I know what, like I said earlier, I know what I wanted to be as a kid growing up. I want to be part of that life, you know? So yeah, it did pique my interest about meeting other people. The Falcone brothers from Utica, right? My Uncle Vinny tells the story. He was getting married in the 60s, early 60s. And my grandfather told him, go to Miami, you go see Joe and Sal Falcone, right? And he told the story just about till he died. He said, Mike, I went to Miami, I did everything else. And these guys were waiting for me, the Fountain Blue, right? They were waiting for me to show up. He says, I went the last day. They had everything ready for me, give me a big party, and open doors for me, you know, because the Fountain Blue and the Diplomat were the major spots in the country for union meetings. All the internationals used to go to the Diplomat and the Fountain Blue at times, mostly the Diplomat. But they had all the entertainment. Sinatra would go to the Fountain Blue. There'd be a lot of big singers there. And my uncle would say, you know, boy, did I screw up. I was supposed to meet the Falcone brothers. My father gave it to me when I got home. You know, so my grandfather's connection with Utica. So that piqued my interest in saying, wow, these guys are really close all over the country. They have all these connections. You know, you talk about Cuba. I heard the Cuba stories. My father's first cousin, Tony, used to go to Cuba. My Uncle Vinny spent a lot of time in Cuba, told a lot of stories about girls.
Not that kind of show.
Yeah. So, you know, they had it, and it's an amazing thing. You know, you're growing up in the house, this guy's there, they went over there, you know, this door opens, that door opens, and these guys treated you great. You know, when you went to a different city, it's not like today, you went to a different city, you had to check in those days. You couldn't just show up because maybe say, what's this guy doing around here? He was going to clip somebody. So you had to go check in whoever was the boss there at that time.
What's interesting about that is the Falcone brothers, they used to live in Brooklyn, and they were from Agrigento. They were from Shaka. So I suspect they were either associates, if not made with the Gambino family before Buffalo up in Utica. And Buffalo controlled the Diplomat Hotel that you just mentioned. So that makes it all fit. See, it all fits together.
Yeah, that's right. And I think till today, they still hold the international meetings at the Diplomat. Okay. I know when I was in the street, they were still going on with a lot of the unions. So very interesting. That really fascinated me about you could go anywhere in the country, just about in certain parts of the world, and have a door open for you.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. When I got married the first time, I was going to Sicily, right? And I told one of the old timers, Joe Cusimano, right? It was an outcrow, right? I wasn't made then. He said, where you going? So I told him I'm going to Taormina. I'm going to go to Paese. I don't know, maybe I get to Palermo, see what I could do. So he goes in the office and he writes a letter for me. He seals the letter, right? I said, what's this? He says, you going to Taormina? I said, yeah. He says, you go ask for a guy named Rosario Vitaliti. You give him this letter. It's okay. I said, you ask him, don't worry about it. He was the boss of the town. Little did I know, right? When I get there, I'm asking everybody, where's Rosario Vitaliti? Nobody's answering me. Finally, I think it was the last day. I find the guy in the sunglass store. Locale Pasoli, right? Sunglasses, right? So the guy understands a little more English. So I'm talking to him. I said, listen, I got this letter from Rosario Vitelliti. And he says, he's dead. He died last week. Out of my luck. But this is, again, this is this connection. Yeah, the guy, I was told where I'm going. He said, wait a minute, hold it up. He wrote a letter. Go find this guy in Sicily. It's fascinating,
They used to do a lot of letters. I mean, we were just talking about your grandfather, but that was common. We don't think of these guys doing that. We think of like, don't put anything on paper, but a lot of it was through letter. I mean, it was a different era.
Different era, yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Oh, WhatsApp. All right. Tony.
Yeah, Fountain Blue was a really important place, and of course, you see it all over the FBI files. A lot of Chicago guys would frequent there. Giancana would hang out there with Sinatra. Supposedly Meyer Lansky. Giancana's one of his daughters. They actually had their wedding gala at the Fountain Blue in the '60s, the early '60s. And Jackie Cerrone, who was a captain and later the underboss, used to go there a lot. And like you said, a lot of union guys. So a lot of those, and I mean, that's a great sort of venue to have guys from different parts of the country meeting each other. A lot of them connected, some of them even members, right?
Yeah, and that leads to another thing, that Florida was like a neutral spot.
It was open territory outside of Tampa, right? Miami and the east coast of Florida, my understanding, that was open territory.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because again, all the families, whoever had any business dealings or anything, went down there. So I think we covered a lot. I think we got a good show.
Absolutely.
And if you could come up with all those documents, I'm interested to see the 1911 with D'Aquila and Trainer. That's a hell of a document.
That's the thing. Michael will tell you a story, and then you find some of these details hidden in documents, some of these anecdotes. I mean, it all fits together, and it just shows you, though. It just shows you that just you alone, the life you lived. You absorbed all, not just what you were experiencing. I mean, we haven't even talked about your time in the Gambino family, but it just shows you like everything else that led to that, everything else that you saw that was from the past, these different connections. It's just incredible.
Well,
Not
the Baltimore thing too. My grandfather had a connection with Baltimore. There was a lot of Bizacanese there, and Joe Gallo handled that. I remember hearing stories about Baltimore in my house. There was a guy who got shot. He lived in upstairs. He was on the lam up there. He got shot. He was up on the lam. He was in a wheelchair, and he was lived upstairs in my house for a while.
I know they had at least one made guy from Bisacchino in the Baltimore crew of the Gambinos. The guy Jimmy Corona. I have no doubt he knew your grandfather's name.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. It really is.
Interesting also that what Eric earlier brought up, Joe Traina, that he was that it seems that he could sort of act as an acting capo de capi in place of D'Aquila. He was sort of his emissary or his spokesman, I guess. There's an account from Col de Gentile that when Chicago had a really important boss, Michele Merlo, who died in 1924. He was from Sambuca also, right? And he died of natural causes. And according to Gentile, this is what caused the sort of outbreak of violence. So there was the Jennas who were famous, was essentially tried to seize control of the family. And Gentile said that the commissione, like a commission, was formed of him. I believe it was Traina, and then some other, he said, representante, because at the time, he believed that Col de Gentile was the boss of the family. And they went to Chicago and they handled it. And a guy named Tony Lombardo got in as boss. So it's interesting that Traina's there because another confidential informant who was an associate that went back to the 1960s, later on in the 1960s, told the FBI that boss Tony Lombardo, who was killed in, I believe, September of 1928. We've talked about him before because he may have been a hit leading up to the hit against D'Aquila, because he may have been one of his supporters. He was the boss of Chicago at the time. But Lombardo was said by this later informant that he was put in by the quote big man in New York as boss in Chicago, and that was done because Sicily got involved and said that the Chicago issue had to be resolved. So it's interesting because we also have Gentile saying that Traina was one of the people that were with him on this panel that was sent to essentially. What happened was a couple of the Jennas wound up getting killed. About 20 other guys. It's Chicago, so like 20 guys got killed over it. But Lombardo becomes boss until he's killed later in 1928. And he's one of the guys that's killed right before right before D'Aquila, essentially, right?
You're right. You just knock some rust off, and Frankie Yale gets killed around that time, just before. I think he got killed in July.
Yep.
And there was a
July.
connection with Chicago, and supposedly the Chicago guys came down and clipped him.
Yeah, yeah, and he was connected. I mean, I don't know if you're into it, but you've said before that there's good reason to believe that Frankie Yale, even if he was a Masseria family member, we know he was a captain, according to Nicola Gentile in the Masseria family, but he was personally close to D'Aquila.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah.
He was told by his son, so can only go by a guy like him.
You can't get a better source than that, huh? You know?
Unless we got Frankie Yale.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, he ain't
Yeah.
talking.
He ain't talking. Yeah.
No, but that's not. Yeah, you're right. I mean, so it's interesting, right? You might think that we don't always know what's happening with some of these murders, and there's a lot of stuff again that came out in the papers, and there's all sorts of myths and legends that surround some of these people. You know, Capone, Frankie Yale, all this stuff. It's like larger than life, right? But you're thinking, if they're going to take out the guy who's boss of bosses, and Masseria is going for this spot, right? He's probably going to try to undermine the support that D'Aquila may have in other families, and getting guys in those families to support him, right?
Oh, 100%. And maybe he took umbrage where maybe Frankie Yale was trying to push for no war. You don't know what Masseria.
You don't know, yeah.
I don't know.
There's very likely guys in Masseria's family who made political alliances with D'Aquila guys. We know that just because you belong to a family certainly doesn't mean you're loyal to the boss.
Correct. As history shows. There'd be no usurping.
Yeah.
We spoke about this a while ago. We talked about downtown Brooklyn versus Bensonhurst. And you mentioned the cultural difference between the two places. And you even mentioned the C word in reference to downtown Brooklyn. Would you mind going into that again for me?
You mean the Cotamora?
Yeah, that I can use you as a source.
I thought of another C word there.
Yeah, there was definitely a difference between downtown and Brooklyn guys, because you think Brooklyn's all the same. It's not. Where I come from on 18th Avenue in Bath Beach, we talk about Bensonhurst as a wide swath, but really was Bath Beach, was Bath Avenue to a certain point that encompasses that. And Bath Beach at one time was called Bloody Bath Beach, because all the murders that took place right in that area. But the downtown guys and us, we were mostly Sicilian in this area. That's what D'Aquila lived in. He lived on 84th Street. Most of the guys lived in that area. Carl, when he came over, lived in that area. Paul Castellano, Bay 14. I mean, all these Sicilians that came over, very influential people, lived right in Bath Beach. The other guys, the Camorra guys and those other guys, they all migrated just about downtown. Not that they weren't in Benson, of course they were, but for the majority. And the mentalities were very, very different, at that time. They were a little more rough from downtown, more rough around the edges as I was growing up. A lot of Colombo guys down there. And different mentality, of course, Junior Persico and the rest of those guys, the Gallows. And then you look at, I think even Gravano makes a comparison to the Colombos and the Gambinos at that time, 60s, 70s. There was a profound difference. And I'm not sure how far that goes back in time. I don't know. But I know from what I've seen, there was a difference between that with the Nappies and the Sicilians. Thank you.
I'd be curious what your grandfather thought of all that. I mean, he got to see all of these changes, and he was old when he passed away, but even long before that, I mean, he was obviously going to be upset about D'Aquila's murder. We know there was a faction of D'Aquila guys who secretly sided with Maranzano to take out Masseria. But even just the cultural changes within the mafia, within guys becoming Americanized, like he must have witnessed so much. I mean, it'd be so interesting to know how he saw that. Was he like these guys, these mainlanders, these Neapolitans, these Calabrese, did he see them as competent, worthy of Cosa Nostra, or was he one of these more conservative guys who was like, this is a Sicilian thing. I come from a village where this informed my identity. It'd be very interesting to know that.
Oh, well, just going about my father, And his revelations to me, if you weren't Sicilian, you didn't count as an Italian. That's what you identify as Sicilian, not Italian. So yeah, my grandfather's friendly with a guy named Willie Moretti, as we've heard of Willie. He wasn't happy with his death. I've heard that in my house. He wasn't happy. My father said he liked Willie, even though he was much younger than him, but he liked Willie. My grandfather was close with a lot of what became the West Side. A lot of those guys, the old timers, very friendly with them. So yeah, there was a difference at that time. He was born 1880. What would it be now? 140 years old, 142. So my father would be 110. So right now, this the other day. So yeah, there was a difference, and you can see there's always a generation gap. And throughout time, there's always something to say. Hey, things ain't what they used to be. Hey, their life ain't the same. It depends. If you get disenchanted with something, everybody says it's not the same, right? If it's great, it's great. When it's bad, it's not the same. I'm different than everybody else. My mentality. But there are generational changes in any aspect of life, and no doubt in this life.
Yeah.
Sammy used to. I heard Sammy say before about how Tato, towards the end, when Tato was stepping down, was kind of moving away. Kind of express, I think he was a little frustrated with some of the changes that he was seeing happening in that life. Stories that Tato shared that, man, this thing's really changing. I always wondered that about your grandfather, because I know you said at the time he was rich, had a lot of money, did well. He was a captain and very respected in that life. But towards the end, it didn't end well for him. So I always wonder, did he ever voice displeasure with that life towards the end? Did he become, or was he always just a guy who, this is the life is the life? Or
yeah, he was extremely proud until he did his last steps coming from his club on Bath Avenue, which was near where Spiro's club was. My grandfather had that club forever on Bath Avenue, and he's very proud to his last days being who he was and what he was. Broke or not, there was no pension plan for him. It was $75 a week. And then I think that stopped after a while. He used to get his home eating fuel for nothing after a while. There was Joe Butcher's family. It was around Joe Butcher's father, Jimmy the Blonde. And the Gambino family had a lot of home heating oil companies, PD Pumps, Ferrara. I don't know if whoever knows the name, PD Pumps. He was a skipper. He was one of those old school guys, from what I understand. I never met him. Really old school. Tato was under him. Jimmy Brown was under him. There was a lot of guys that became captains after PD died of natural causes. He stuck to what and who he was to his last breath, which I almost watched him die. So as an old man, very proud guy. Proud of his friends. He still got cards. He still, people who was alive still sent them Christmas cards and stuff like that. And some fruit baskets and stuff. There were still guys stay true to the code.
And did he know you were already gravitating toward that life? Because you said since you're 12 years old, you want to be a Gambino captain. So did he see you gravitating toward that? Was that something you were aware of?
Well, I was 16 when he passed, and there was a days of long hair, being a little hippie-ish, I guess, and, even though my hair it was shoulder length and longer, you were a hippie, like the song. Okay. About hair. No, but he's seen it. My brothers, don't forget, I had a brother 9 and 10 years, 2 brothers, 9, 10 years my senior, and who were in the street. He knew that was in our blood. And he would take me in the yard, he would talk to me, try to toughen me up as a kid, and stuff like that. And there's little conversations, there's little anecdotes, used to hear, don't eat too much, you choke. Don't kill the horse that pulls the cart. There was a lot of things that he would reflect to in his life. I was just too young to really get it all at that time.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I find that interesting too. I asked Michael before if his mother and father knew when he became maid, or when he got in, when it was it's official, this is what you are. Because it just shows how in that society, it's different from the insider, because as an outsider you would think your mom's like, get the hell away from this, what are you talking about? But he said no, they were proud. Right.
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
proud. Yeah.
My father was very, very proud. Extremely. Matter of fact, we were in Florida one time, and Junior pulls my father on the side and tells him, go congratulate your son. He's a skipper. He's a captain.
Wow.
That's amazing, right? It just shows you, it really is something that it has a spiritual element to it. That's how I always say it's a spirituality to a certain extent.
I mean, to have the same rank your grandfather had in the same family. I mean, what RJ's saying seems very true to me. I can't imagine what that's like being you, to be like, I'm doing what my grandfather did in this very, very exclusive world that very few people are part of.
Yeah, you're right. And you know what? I've said this probably a couple of times, is that, you know, as a little kid, you aspired to grow up to be something. Fireman, cop, lawyer, Indian chief, whatever it is. I lived up to what I wanted to do. I accomplished what I wanted. How many people could say that? And going along the line what you said, it was something that was in my family. A cop son becomes a cop. You know, his grandson's a cop. You know, that's the tradition. Fireman, the same thing. My thing was Cosa Nostra. That's what I wanted. That's what I looked up to. That's what I admire, for the good, bad, and the indifferent. Because it's not that I was naive. I didn't see the bad things. Of course I did. I see a lot of guys, you know about a lot of guys who get murdered. You know, all bad things happen to them. So it's not that I went in with my eyes closed and say, I want to be my grandfather,
Yeah.
I try to carry a tradition my way, the way I was brought up, So yeah, it was absolutely a proud moment for me, a proud time of my life growing up. I was very, very measured in the street, measured. There's the things I did in the street, not to taint my name, like dealing drugs, et cetera, at that time. It wasn't worth, the risk reward wasn't there for that. Too much to lose, by having your name tainted that way. So among other things that you would do, and it was just about building a reputation. And, Mr. Jimmy's grandson, Mr. Jimmy's grandson, that's the way it be. It was this Mr. Jimmy's grandson. To continue with the old timers, that just, and so it was a badge of honor to say that, oh, I knew my grandfather, you knew my, yeah. I had a lot of people come over and have a lot of conversations with me. Your grandfather, when he get mad, that cigar used to go back and forth. You don't know your grandfather used to go.
That's the thing I always say, that, when I look at Cosa Nostra history, I always try to look at the difference between like what separates it from like gang culture and like Cosa Nostra culture. And what I see the difference between gang culture, like street gangs and stuff like that, there's some kind of like religious components to Cosa Nostra. It's, even down to earning your right to even come into this thing, putting in, there's a grooming period. It's a developmental process. It's not just, hey, I'm here now. It's just, it has this, even down to how they make you in the ceremony where, you're dripping blood and you're taking an oath and you're taking a vows. Like, it's just, it has a lot of religious properties to it.
You're right, RJ, because the thing is, they say you're born again.
Yeah. Into a new life.
Any beefs, anything you have in your life before today, leave it outside. Don't bring it in here. It's over. In theory, in structure wise, it's a good thing. Not good for society, but it's good to keep the thing going. The structure, respect. Don't raise your hands to another member. Don't call another member a liar. These are all things you could die for. You know what I mean? You have these rigid rules. Sure, they're broken over time, and that have the hypocrisies and double standards are always going to be there. But in its purest sense, what they set out to be was a structure to last. That's the whole thing about this. And it did last, and it's still here. In spite of all the mistakes, in spite of all the animals that came out of that life, that did bad things and hurt guys for no reason, for power and greed, it's still here.
Mhm.
right? Because of some of these rules. Are these rules being watered down today? We see the newspaper and everything else. Yes, but do they have the same bite as they did? No. So in one respect, it equals it out. Because if you had all these things that are going south and these disrespect and those broken rules, if you had those guys that still bid hard, be a lot more bodies in the street, or a lot more guys straightening it up and walking 2 feet in one shoe. So, it's no killings, more disorganized, more not structured.
The discipline isn't there.
Right.
It doesn't have at least from what I look at, I feel like it doesn't have the development anymore where they groom you, where someone takes you as a little boy, 9, 10 years old, and they groom you up to how this works, how this life works. And if you look at a lot of guys that were in it for a long time, they all have a story. I find that they all have a story. They say, well, my uncle. You can look at guys like, Phil Leonetti's a great example. I think Nicky Scarfo's a lunatic, but the way he said, I was like 7 or 8, and he would had me in the car riding with me saying, we are our own government. We don't listen to their rules. We got our own rules. We abide by this type of a system. I heard Michael talk about that. I heard a lot of guys talk about how it was like a process, where you get developed and you get groomed, and people had a mentor, and it meant something. Sammy talked about that with Toto when he got placed in with the Gambinos. He said Toto would say, sit over there and you listen, and I want you to watch, this meeting I'm about to do. And I want you, and he would, and Toto, I'm not saying he always listened, but the process was there, like the grooming part. Toto attempted to groom Sammy.
That's so well said. And that's maestro, professore, right? These are the guys that are teaching, of course, they have an interest in you. They don't want to see you go astray. When Sammy says Toto loved him, I do believe that for time. I don't know if after he killed Paul, if he loved him the same. But before that, he had an interest in his product and making that product come out good. He wanted to be proud of him because, it's not his blood son, but it's his son. That's his father, right? In that family, as Toto's, John's much younger than Toto, but that's his father now in its purest sense of that life. If you take guys like yourselves, what's important to me is how you see us. I get from how you view us. How's the citizens view us today? That's when I see crazy stories in the paper about things going on. I say, oh my God, this is an embarrassment. You know what I mean? Have some kind of respect, that the people that look at you. What have we become? The movies now, like a cheap mob movie? So, but it's important how you guys all reflect and look at us and the citizens that who like this stuff. That's why I get such a big kick out of what RJ's created here with me. There's all the input that we get back. That's why I was driven to get you guys on board and out of the shadows and get you on, so I can have a conversation with you. RJ could have anybody now on the outside can come in and go to mob archaeologists and have a sensible, good, historic conversation. Seek history, seek out questions. And maybe we may not see the fruits this way, money-wise, but there'll be fruits and reward of self, something that you've created, and it's going to be there for a while, forever, if it wants to be, So that's why I got utmost respect for you guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just my whole thing is just I want to do something that I feel good about, that the other guys feel good about. And I feel like if we do that, we're doing what we're supposed to do, is just let's put something out where we're saying what we mean, what we've researched. And if we feel good about that, that's great. And if one person feels the same way and enjoys the conversation, that's great. I mean, I know, I imagine a lot of people will be enjoying this one. It's been an honor to have you guys on and to hear this just firsthand. It's one thing to hear it from us as historians. We do our best, but to actually hear things that are casual to you. I mean, some of these things, like something some guy said to you once, to us, that's like, oh my God, you know.
Well,
No,
I
what
can-
you guys do though is that cuts someone off. Oh, I feel like what you guys do is some of the most important, if not the most important work on YouTube, because you guys, there's a bunch of channels that's dedicated to telling the more contemporary story, telling a story. If you from 1980 forward, you have a plethora of channels that you can get information from, but nobody goes back to the essence of what made this thing. And even the channels that make the attempt, they all inaccurately start at 1931, and they think 1931, God sent Lucky Luciano to bless the U.S. with an American Cosa Nostra. You know, and you guys are putting the information out to say, no, hold on, guys. There's been things going on, 70 years. I mean, 50 years before Lucky Luciano, 60 years before Lucky Luciano. There was structure, there was organization, there was meetings, there was voting, there was panels, and so you guys bring something so needed to the table that I think what you guys do is it's just very needed, brilliant, and respected a lot by me.
Thank you.
And but I gotta say to people, if they haven't, if they're watching us and they haven't watched No Excuses, I don't know what they're doing. Like they gotta get their priorities straight and check out No Excuses before they have a right to check us out.
There's no excuses, so it don't matter what the reason is.
No,
Thank
You know what? If you don't know anything in life, you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. You got to know where you came from. And, there's a history lesson for the guys if they want to be in the street. There's a history lesson here. In any street, there's a history lesson about crime and structure and where you're going to go in the pitfalls. So
There was a Colombo guy who got arrested a few years ago, and he had a copy of John Dickey's book in his trunk. And John Dickey's a great historian, and I was like, he's reading the right stuff. If for a guy in the life, I'm like, he's choosing right.
well, see that? That's a guy with initiative. He took it, but he didn't have a mentor. So maybe his mentor is somebody, and you know what? You got to give the guy a lot of credit, whoever he may be.
Yep.
All right. And this is our latest episode. We'd like to thank Michael and RJ for both coming on. We very appreciate all their contributions and how they're able to shed light onto this subject that we're all trying to explore and learn more about. And I wish everyone a good evening.
Merry Christmas to everybody.
Merry Christmas.
thank you.
And happy Hanukkah. You got to cover all the bases.
Of course.
Ecumenical.